Hello, and welcome to another episode of Understanding. I'm Craig Biddle, and thanks for joining. Today, we're going to talk about two things. We're going to compare altruism and egoism in relation to how they relate specifically and respectively to pragmatism and principled thinking. And this is something that I talk a lot about with the team I work with at OSI. And I've done a little bit of writing about this stuff, but it's a rich subject. And I think if you get your head around it, even if you get your head partially around it, and then work with it over time, you'll find that this is really fruitful in many ways. It's got a lot of use value in understanding morality and how we know what we know and what the relationship between those two fields is. So basically morality and epistemology. So let's start with some definitions. And by the way, after I speak for maybe 10, 15 minutes about this topic, we'll take some questions both about this topic and about anything else that might be on your mind. So let's define our terms first. Altruism is the sort of prevalent morality in certainly in the United States, but in the West in general. It's the idea that being moral consists in self-sacrificially serving others. So alter is Latin for other. Altruism means otherism. The other is a goal. The other is the standard of value, so to speak. You should serve the other insofar as you're serving the other and not serving yourself insofar as you're serving the other selflessly. You're being moral, and insofar as you're not, you're not. It's pretty black and white. And then egoism is the idea that being moral consists in self-interestedly serving yourself while respecting the rights of others to do the same. Now, I'm using the full version of egoism here, not the narrow, blinded version where it's just, oh, I'll do whatever I feel like doing. Because doing whatever you feel like doing without thinking in terms of the long range and wide range consequences of your actions is actually not good for you. So it's not egoistic, it's not self-interested. To be self-interested, you have to understand reality. You have to understand your actual needs. You have to understand your long-term needs in relation to your nature. And you have to understand your wide range needs. We have lots of needs, both short-term and long-term. And being an egoist, acting in a way that is consistently good for your life, requires understanding all of that and acting accordingly. So altruism is the idea that being moral consists in self-sacrificially serving others. Because if you self-interestedly serve others, if you're a dentist and you're serving your patients and they're paying you money and you love your work and you're making money doing it, right? You're serving others, but you're doing it in an egoistic way. So altruism does not countenance that. It won't put up with that. It would say, in effect, well, at best, that's neutral. To be moral, you actually have to selflessly serve others. And egoism says that that's wrong, that you should not selflessly serve others, that you should self-interestedly serve others, and that this is not an easy thing to do because, first of all, you should self-interestedly serve yourself, but then in dealing with others, you should make sure that your relationships are good for you and good for the people you trade with, because that's how you form good relationships, whether business relationships or friendships or romantic relationships, all of which are good for you if you form and maintain them correctly. So our first two definitions here are altruism and egoism. And what I want to talk about is the way in which altruism, to the extent that you accept it, requires that you abandon principles in your life. And egoism, to the extent that you accept it, requires that you adopt principles, that you ground your principles in reality, and that you then act on those principles consistently. And this is an interesting fact about these two moral codes that helps to really sort of shed light on both of them and on their differences. So let's take altruism first. if the idea is that to be moral, you must selflessly serve other people, you must give up, not gain values from your trades and interactions with other people, but all exchanges with other people need to result in a net loss for you, because insofar as they result in a net gain, that's egoistic. You're getting something from the relationship or from the exchange. So you're not supposed to gain there. And now, if you adopt this moral code, the idea, oh, I ought to be selfless, I ought to self-sacrificially serve others as a matter of course, as a matter of principle in life, what is going to happen to you over just the next 7 or 8 days? What's going to happen if you consistently and without failure give up the values that otherwise would serve your life and serve other people with those values, or give those values to other people? Where are you going to be in 7 or 8 days? Well, if you take this really consistently, you will be dead, right? Because any food you might eat or nutrition you might enjoy, or any air you might breathe, ultimately could be in some way given to someone else, right? So you're consuming goods in order to remain alive, but there are other people who could consume those goods. Maybe not air, because that's everywhere and essentially free, but your food, your relationships, any time you put into doing things that you love, let's say you love golfing, or you love sailing, or you love watching movies with your friends, right? If you're getting something out of this, then you're not selflessly serving other people, which means you're not being moral. To be moral, you must consistently and on principle selflessly serve other people. And if you do that, you cannot live, right? And because altruism requires this kind of action, but this kind of action is completely contrary to your life, in order to live as an altruist, you have to cheat on your moral code as a matter of regular course. You have to cheat on it all the time. You cannot uphold the principle of altruism, the idea that you should self-sacrificially serve others, as a matter of principle, as a matter of course. Because if you do, you will die. So altruism, by its very nature, makes following principles, especially moral principles, impossible. Because if you were to follow the moral principles when you adopt altruism, you simply won't live for very long. So altruists have to take the position, well, you can't go by principle. Principles aren't practical. They don't work. Yes, it's true that we should be selflessly serving other people, and you got to do that some, perhaps a lot. But you can't do it as a matter of principle. You can't uphold this principle as a matter of principle, because if you do, you can't live. So altruism requires people to adopt a pragmatic approach to religion. Pragmatism is, and I don't mean here the businessman's version of pragmatism, where businessmen say, well, what's going to work to, increase productivity and increase profits, by legitimate means. That's a loose version of the concept of pragmatism, but the school of philosophy called pragmatism is the school that holds that there are no principles, there are no absolutes that are grounded in reality that we should embrace and fully live by. And altruism requires that people basically take that position, at least in the realm of morality, because if you try to live by it on principle, you can't. So the idea is, well, moral things, morality is important, but it's not practical. So we have to adopt this morality, but then cheat on it and do whatever we can, basically, to try to live while also at times self-sacrificially serving others, whether, serving people in a soup kitchen when you'd rather be doing something else, or whatever is going to, sink that boat for you. So that's altruism. Now let's look at egoism and see how that relates to principle. So let's say you adopt egoism, the idea that you should self-interestedly serve yourself, that you should act in a consistently self-interested manner, and that you should do so by thinking about the long range and wide range requirements of your life, given the kind of being you are. So you've got material requirements, spiritual requirements like purpose and self-esteem, and freedom is an important one. If you don't have liberty, you can't live. So you're going to set out to figure out what values are necessary, what values and what actions are necessary for you to live a wonderful life for the span of many decades. Now, do you need principles to do that? Do you need to figure out what is fundamentally true about the world in which you live and what is fundamentally true about your nature and your needs in order to live a fully integrated, beautiful life where your material needs and your spiritual needs and your long range needs and your wide range needs, this whole big sphere of the factual requirements of a flourishing life for you? Do you need to understand the fundamental nature of your needs and of reality so that you can function successfully in reality? There. Well, obviously you do, right? There's all sorts of things you need to know. We're not born knowing what is going to make our lives wonderful. We have to figure that out. And then we have to codify it into it. Once we understand, I need to have a productive career so that I have income, and I need to have a career that I love so that when I'm spending 8 hours or more a day doing this thing, I'm enjoying myself. So I've got to figure that out. I've got to find friends who are good people. So I've got to be able to judge character. So I got to figure out how to judge character. I need to figure out how to integrate my limited time or designate my limited time to both my career, my friendships, my romantic relationships, my recreational relationships. Like, you got to do a lot of things to make your life wonderful. And you're not born knowing this. And frankly, you're probably not going to hear from adults or your parents, preachers, or teachers how to do this either, because not many people think about this for reasons we'll get to in a bit. But the fact is here that you need principles, because principles are fundamental truths about the nature of reality. They're fundamental truths about human nature or the way that things are that we need to understand and then utilize in our thinking and our actions. That's what a principle is. And now there are invalid principles. In fact, we were just talking about one, the principle of altruism, the idea that being moral consists in self-sacrificially serving others, is a principle insofar as it is a fundamental idea that people try to live by. But it's not a true principle because there are no facts of reality that give rise to or support the idea that you should sacrifice, which is why no one's ever provided these kinds of truths. So, or these such evidence or such facts. Whereas if we say, are there any facts of reality that support the idea that you should use your mind to figure out what values will serve your life and happiness, both long range and wide range? The whole world is full of facts that support this, right? If you wake up and you're like, what should I do today? And you want to live a wonderful life, there are a whole lot of facts that say, well, you ought to do something productive that's going to add to your life. If you sit around all day and waste your time scrolling on social media or smoking pot or whatever, your life isn't going to go well. So what do you need to do? You need to figure out the things you need to do. Hello? Who is that? Jackson?
Sorry, Greg. Keep going.
No problem. So to live this way, to live as an egoist, you really do. You need to figure out what's true, codify into fundamental truths like, oh, I need to go by reason. That's a fundamental truth. I need purposes in life. I need long-range goals and things I'm after that make my life meaningful. And those are your purposes in life, your career, your romantic relationship, things like that. And this takes a lot of thinking, right? So on this level, we can see that altruism requires pragmatism because you can't live by the principle that allegedly you're supposed to live by. Egoism absolutely requires principle and eschews pragmatism. Pragmatism is not good. If you just say, well, what's going to work, to get me through the day, you can't answer that question unless you say, well, what am I trying to do? What are my purposes? What are the facts of reality? What are the fundamental truths that I need to know in order to make my life wonderful? If you're not going by those, if you're just going by, oh, what happened, what occurs to me that I might do today, and how can I get it done, which is sort of the pragmatic approach to life, then you're just going haphazardly through life and you're not going to live a beautiful life. And you probably know a lot of people who live this way, right? And that's why they're not happy. Egoism, living a really wonderful, thoughtful, value-laden life requires knowledge of a lot of things, and that requires that you integrate that knowledge into principles that you can use to guide your thinking and actions. So this is just stage one of this interesting difference between altruism and pragmatism on the one hand, and egoism and principle on the other. Now, observe here that the idea of altruism also doesn't require any principles for you beyond the principle that you should sacrifice, because altruism is not telling you to do anything that's particularly difficult. It's very easy to give up all your values. You just stop acting for the things that you want and give your stuff to other people. As Jesus said, if you want to be my disciple, give away or sell all your goods and follow me, right? You just give stuff away and you're done. And then to be a selfless person is very easy because you don't have to do anything. That's exactly what selflessness is about. To be selfish, you have to do all sorts of things. So it's just an interesting fact about these two codes that this is a feature of each of them. Now, I want to say one word about their relationship to compartmentalization and to integration. On the altruist side, you have to compartmentalize. You have to segregate your moral code from the way you're going to live. They can't be integrated because the moral code is anti-life. On the egoism side, you can completely integrate your moral code and all of the principles that you're going to adopt and live by, because they're basically one in the same big super system of ideas. It's like, oh, if I want to live a wonderful life, long range, and take into account all of my material and spiritual values, all the things that are really important to me, then I need to know a lot. Let's get that knowledge in order. So you work to do that. And then you get to integrate this goal, this life of beauty and wonder and joy. You get to integrate that with all of the activities and ideas and actions that you have to take and embrace in order to live that way. So there's no compartmentalization necessary. It's one big integrated whole. Now, if you think about this in terms of virtues, altruism, with this compartmentalization and this segregation of your moral code from your principles of action, the way that you're actually going to work and you're actually going to act in life, altruism requires you to be hypocritical. It requires you to adopt this moral code, but then abandon the moral code and act in other ways. Whereas egoism requires you to be a man of integrity, to be a person of integrity. Why? Because in order to get the goal, in order to have the goal, to achieve the goal you're trying to achieve, which is a beautiful, wonderful life, you must act consistently in concert with these principles that are your means of doing that thing. So you can maintain fully this integrated approach to these things, which makes you an integrated person. And that's, of course, where this concept of integrity comes from. So you can see a big difference there, right? A compartmentalization and the need for hypocrisy, and integration and the need for integrity. And then the last thing I'll say about this is, look at the fact that the self-help industry exists, right? What's the purpose of this whole big self-help industry? It's I think it's tens of billions of dollars a year goes into this industry. You've got people like James Clear and Greg McEwen and David Allen and all sorts of people, whether they're, it's business self-help or general life self-help or what. And what this industry is about, and it's a beautiful industry. I granted that there are some hucksters in it and some charlatans, but the thoughtful people in this industry, what are they trying to do? They're trying to help you and me to understand how, on what principles, to live a beautiful life. How do you make your life wonderful? How do you do that? This industry exists and is, for the most part, in people's minds, kept away from morality. There's very little moral talk about self-help. But on the egoistic view, they're one and the same. They integrate just like egoism integrates with principles, and egoism and principles integrate with integrity. That whole thing integrates with the whole idea of self-help, self-development, making your life great. There's no equivalent industry under altruism. Nobody writes books about here are all the principles to give all your values away and suffer and die, right? The closest you get to this kind of thing is either the Bible telling you, you ought to sacrifice in the various ways that the Bible calls for that, or you get something like the effective altruism movement, where they're saying, well, you need to make a lot of money if you want to help other people. The best way to do it is make a lot of money so that you can give a lot of that money to other people. But believe you me, these guys who make a lot of money, they're not giving it all to other people. They're not living as paupers. They're living pretty damn good lives. They're just violating the principle of altruism in order to live that life. And then they're trying to compromise by giving huge amounts of their money away to assuage their guilt for having made the money and for living to some extent a better life than they would be if they gave it all away. So which books do altruists buy if they want to figure out how to live a beautiful life? They buy the same books the egoists do. They buy James Clear's Atomic Habits or Greg McKeown's Essentialism or the like. And they read them and they just segregate the whole business of making their lives great from this wretched, poisonous moral code that they have adopted. And if you think of egoism and altruism this way, and this is just the tip of the iceberg, so you can, do your own thinking on this and think through it. Look for examples. You find them all over the place. It really sheds light on the nature of and the difference between these two moral codes. And it shows why one of them, namely egoism, is true. It's grounded in reality. It's supported by facts. It is derived from observation and logic, and it integrates with everything else we know about human life and the world in general. Whereas altruism, this idea that you should self-sacrificially serve others, doesn't integrate with anything except other nonsense, like various claims from religion. And it's not grounded in reality at all. There aren't any facts that give rise to the idea that you should sacrifice. So anyway, that's what I wanted to talk about briefly today, just to get the ball rolling. With that, we'll go ahead and take questions. If you have a question you'd like to ask me live, you can click on the link in the comment column, and Jackson, who's with me today, will queue you up for that. And I know we've got some written questions from last week that we'll start with probably before we dive into any of the live questions. So Jackson, where are we with some written questions, or do we have some live questions to start with?
We do have a person in the waiting room. Kirk, I'm going to add you to the stage. Let's see. And there we go. Kirk, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, it's good to see you. I've watched some of your content. I consider myself a student of philosophy, although I'm not personally a student of Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism. But I have some questions related to a relationship between objectivist philosophy and science. So it's a broad topic, but and I don't know if you feel qualified to answer some of them, but I'll throw them out there and can we see what we can do?
Sure. If I'm not qualified, I'll let you know.
Okay. So the first question is the relationship between objectivism and physics, specifically theoretical physics. So to my understanding, Ayn Rand believed in a Aristotelian concept of space and time, where space and time are absolute relations between things in motion, and is what time is, and then space is a relation between things between places. Is that correct?
I don't think that Ayn Rand wrote about space and time at all. So I'm not sure where you're getting that from. Now, Ayn Rand was essentially Aristotelian in her metaphysics, and I think she would have defined time as the measure of the measurement of objects or entities in motion, which is as I understand it, the correct definition of time. And then space, and by the way, one of the things Ayn Rand did say, she said that cosmology and the other special sciences are really distinct from objectivism, which is a philosophy, and that philosophers should not pretend that they know physics and biology and other sciences when they don't. So I don't have much to say about physics myself, and I certainly can't speak for Rand because I don't recall her even speaking much about physics. I think she did at one point define time as something along the lines of measurement of objects in motion, but that may not even be right. I'd have to go look that up. I don't remember her ever talking about what space is. And so what I'll say about space is that why do we need the concept of space? Just to begin with, at the layman's level, we need the concept of space because we deal with objects in this world, and there are distances between the objects we deal with. There's a distance between that wall on one side of my room and that wall on the other. And we use the concept of space often in a case like this to say, how much space is there in this room? In other words, how much area is there for me to work with if I'm putting in furniture or I've got to lay down a rug or whatever. And that's a legitimate use of the concept of space. Now, when you get into the concept of space as physicists use it, whether you're talking about outer space and what is that stuff we're talking about out there, is outer space a place where there's nothing, or is there something there that fills up what we're identifying as space? Here in this room, what fills up the area that we're identifying as space is air, right? So there's something here. It's not actually space, it's air. If by space you mean an empty region. I don't know if there's any such thing as an empty region. At the very least, if you say, let's say I hold my hands up and you go, there's nothing between my hands. And I say, what about air? And you say, nope, not even air. There's nothing in there. And then I say, well, what about a region? Is there a region between my hands? And you said, nope, no region at all. Then we'd have to go like this because there would be literally nothing between my hands, including a region. So I'm not sure how it is that physicists try to define space, or whether any of them, and believe you me, physicists disagree probably more so than even philosophers do on the things that they talk about. So I doubt that there's any single agreed upon, perfect definition of space if they're trying to define what exists in a vacuum, so to speak. Maybe you know otherwise, but anyway, that's what I know about space. And I already mentioned how I would define time. So tell me, Kirk, are you a physicist, and do you have any specialized knowledge in this field?
So I'm not a specialized physicist. I've taken classes in physics and I've listened to lectures in physics. So I have a little bit, I would say, an intermediate knowledge of physics. However, the specific criticisms I would have of objectivism, certain objectivist axioms, as I understand them, with as it relates to the relationship between objectivism and physics, is so it's twofold. So the first thing is, the way I've heard David Harriman speak, are you familiar at all with Harriman's work in the
Yes.
relationship between physics and philosophy? Yeah.
Yeah.
So the way I've heard Harriman define space and time is exactly what you said, relational concepts, as opposed to the Newtonian view that they're substantial concepts, which is independent of the physical entities within them. They're relational to the entities within them, not absolute apart from the entities within them, as I've heard Harriman describe the objectivist position on space and time. If that's not the objectivist position on space and time, I could be mistaken. I've only read a little bit of Ayn Rand's
Yeah,
writings.
I would be surprised if he, at least in his book, The Logical Leap, which I know Leonard Peikoff helped him write, I would be surprised if he said in there that there was an objectivist view of space and time, because that would just be false. And I don't think he said that in that book. I read that book a long time ago. So yeah, he may have said that's his view of space and time, and it might also be Leonard Peikoff's view of space and time, and it may be a correct view of space and time. I don't know, but I don't think it's an objectivist view. So yeah, what we should do probably is leave objectivism out of this, because we're talking about physics, and objectivism just doesn't have positions on physics. But we can still talk about it. The only problem of talking much about it is that I'm relatively ignorant of it. I really don't know. I took physics in high school, and that was the end of my physics studies. So
Okay, so the main thing that I've heard is that I've heard an objectivist philosopher named Charles too say that um, the objectivist position, at least on time, he didn't say space. He said space is a relational concept, but he didn't attribute it to objectivism. But I do recall pretty explicitly him saying that the objectivist position is that time is the measurement of things in motion. If he
yeah,
was misrepresenting
anytime you
around,
hear someone say the objectivist position on physics, or even the objectivist position on politics, unless they're talking about the fundamental principle of politics, which is the principle of individual rights or some clear and obvious application of that, they're just wrong, because objectivism doesn't have positions on specific, like, if somebody says, what's the objectivist position on gerrymandering or something like that. There is no objectivist position on most narrow things in politics. There's an objectivist position on broad things in politics. Likewise for physics. All objectivism is going to say about physics is physicists, just as all other special scientists, have to stay within the realm of reason, which means they have to stay within the realm of the laws of identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle, and causality. Basically, there are four laws there that philosophy properly gets to say to other scientists. These are the fundamental laws of reality, and if you think in your, or you surmise or you hypothesize in your field that one of these laws doesn't hold, that things don't act in accordance with their natures, or that a thing can be both A and non-A at the same time and in the same respect, or anything of the sort, then you've erred. That's really all that proper philosophy proper gets to say to the other sciences. And other than that, we just need to, physicists need to tell us what they've discovered. They go, oh, look, we saw this thing called the redshift. And then we go, okay, what's that? And they can tell us what it is and why they think, what they think is causing it. But as soon as they say something like, this particle moves from point A to point B without traversing the space in between, or something that is obviously a contradiction, I believe, and I think this is the only kind of thing that philosophers get to say. We can just say, I think you need to recheck your premises here, and your thinking and your experiments, and be willing to say, we noted that the electron or the particle moved from here to here, and we were unable to detect it traversing the space in between. That doesn't mean it didn't traverse the space in between. It means you didn't detect it, right? And that's the kind of thing that I think philosophers can say, is you've got to check your premises if you think you've got a contradiction on your hands. But that's kind of the end of what philosophers get to say.
okay, but even then, I would say there are certain elements of theoretical physics which would challenge objectivist metaphysics in this respect. And um, so if I was mistaken, then my first argument would be wrong, because my first argument was based off of Einstein's theory of relativity, which says that time dilates. And to me, time dilating would necessarily mean time would have to be independent of physical motion, because if time can dilate, that means it has its own existence as a substance.
Yeah.
So
So the
that would
problem
because
at this point, Kirk, is that I don't even know what it means to say that time dilates. To my mind, that is literally senseless. And I'm not. I don't know enough about physics to have a firm position on this. But if time is the measurement of things in motion, which is the only concept of time, that's the only way I can make sense of time, is because the facts of reality that give rise to the need of the concept of time, as far as I can tell, are that we need to measure things in motion. This is why when the Earth spins once on its axis, we say, oh, that's 24 hours. And when the Earth goes around the sun one time, we go, oh, that's 365 days. We'll call that a year, and so on and so forth. Those are the kinds of facts that give rise to the need of the concept of time to begin with. Now, if physicists have some special use where they're going to start talking about time dilating, I have no idea what that means. Maybe it means something, but to my non-physicist mind, it sounds like gibberish. So I can't, unfortunately, I can't do much. Now I'm happy to hear you tell me more, but I can't tell you any more about these
Okay.
subjects because I don't know.
So from the lectures and tests that I've taken on general relativity in both my school and in lectures I've watched on YouTube and from online tests I've taken about general and special relativity, is the idea of time dilation is that when you move really, really fast, time slows down relative to you. So if you have Bob stays on Earth and Alice leaves Earth and Alice goes really, really fast, she'll end up younger than Bob when she gets back.
Yeah, heard all of this. So it's not that I haven't heard this stuff. It just doesn't make sense to me because if you say that time slows down, um, what does that mean? Measurements slow down? So again, to my mind, because maybe I have a frozen abstraction on what time means. That's possible, but no one has been able to show me yet. And I've had these kinds of conversations, several times. No one's been able to give me a coherent definition of time that suits the definition that is just sort of at closer to the perceptual level, the one that I'm working with, but that also makes sense of things like the characteristics you're describing here that, according to relativity, are the case. So let me do this because I know we've got other people who want to ask questions. Do you have a question for me that you and I can discuss that doesn't go too deep into this? Because what's going on if you go that direction is I don't know what you're talking about, and I doubt my audience does. So then you're just kind of
Okay.
monologuing when no one knows what you're talking about,
Okay.
which doesn't mean what you're saying doesn't make sense. It just means my ignorance is part of the equation here.
Okay, yeah. So then the second part, I think you might say this is actually something that might be more in your realm because this is more directly philosophical and less specialized physics. I don't think you need specialized understanding of physics to understand this concept. There are interpretations of quantum physics which deny a mind-independent reality, which say that observation constructs the collapse of the wave function. And
Heard
another
this.
thing, yeah,
I've
and
heard
then
this
there's
too, and it doesn't make any sense to me at all. I think it's contradictory, but I don't know enough about quantum physics, let alone regular physics, to get into this discussion either. I will say this from a philosophic perspective. Um, I know there's a mind independent reality in the sense that there's realities out there, whether I am paying attention to it or not. And this is why when people wander into traffic and get hit by trucks, their lack of attention to the oncoming truck has no consequence. Well, it does have consequence, but I mean, it doesn't make the truck go away, right? It doesn't mean the truck isn't there. The truck is there, and it's going to hit you whether you are paying attention to it or not, and whether you recognize it or not. And so, at a very, very simple perceptual level, the idea that there's no mind independent reality is absurd. And I don't know how quantum physicists try to deal with that fact, but I suspect they have to do a lot of mental gymnastics to try to deal with it.
Yeah, and then the final thing I was going to ask related to physics injectors, and then I'll call it here because I think you want to move on. Is
Sure.
that there is, so I don't know if you've heard of Bell's theorem, but there's a theorem in physics known as Bell's theorem, which shows that the outcomes of a quantum system cannot be influenced by hidden local variables. So this means that basically there are two possibilities: either the consciousness causes the wave function to collapse, or if there's a hidden variable which causes different outcomes in a quantum measurement system, it has to be spooky action at a distance. So in this case, this would be a case of event ontology of causation, whereas an entity ontology of causation, because events can cause other events at long distances without any intermediate entities.
Yeah. No, I've heard all of this too, and none of it makes sense to me. So again, it's possible that I'm ignorant and that there are certain items of missing knowledge in my mind that, if I had them, would make sense of these things. But I operate with the concepts available to me as a layperson, not a physicist, and as a philosopher. So I have a whole toolbox of concepts. But for the concepts that I use, I can identify in just general layman's terms the facts that give rise to all of them. And that's the area that I do my work in. And I just don't know what's going on in quantum physics. So I just can't say any more about it. But the way that you described all of that regarding the wave function and spooky, action at a distance and all of that, I've heard it all, but none of it makes sense as far as I can
Okay.
tell. And I know this too. Not all physicists agree on this stuff. There's huge debates about all of this. So it's not like it's settled science that, so and so, that this is the way that things are. There's a huge debate going on about all of this, and I'm just too ignorant to weigh in on it
Okay.
beyond what I've said.
That's okay. Thank you for your time, and I really appreciate you entertaining my questions.
Yeah, my pleasure, and thanks for the question. They were good questions. I just wasn't qualified to answer them.
That's
So.
okay. Bye-bye.
All right, Jackson, who do we have next, or are we going to do some written questions?
We're going to take a written question. So this was from an anonymous user, and he or she asks, why do you think altruism, wrong question. Would it be fair to say that most people who use the term altruism are not practicing altruism in the absolute? Most seem to be expressing that the welfare of others is among their hierarchy of values. If acting on that value contributes to their own happiness and life satisfaction, would that constitute rational self-interest?
Yes, you can be, and most people are confused about what altruism actually means. A lot of people think it just means goodwill or benevolence toward other people, which certainly goodwill toward others and benevolence toward others, if you don't have any reason to believe that the others in question are bad people, is a self-interested policy, right? For the same reason that we treat a person as innocent until proven guilty in a court of law, right? Until we have evidence and demonstrable evidence that a person is guilty, we treat him as innocent. It doesn't mean he is innocent, and we treat him that way. The same is true at the level of just basic logic. If you're going to draw a conclusion, a negative conclusion about someone, you have to have evidence to support the negative conclusion. If you're going to say a person did a bad thing or is bad, there has to be something that he did that makes him bad. And if you don't have that knowledge, you have no logical right to treat him as bad or to treat him, as with contempt or disrespect. So for this reason, it's proper both logically and egoistically, these integrate beautifully, to assume of everyone you deal with, unless you have evidence to the contrary, that they're good people, that the person is good. And the fact is, the vast majority of people are good. The vast majority of people are trying to figure out what's true and live good lives. The problem is they've got bad philosophy, including altruism. And what happens with altruism is people accept it essentially as a package deal because they don't think about how to define terms clearly. So They package together being nice to people or being benevolent toward people with the idea that being moral consists in acting selflessly, right? And this is why people uphold someone like a Mother Teresa or a Jesus as a a paragon of virtue, because they really sacrificed. And then most people feel like, well, I'm not going to be that good, but I'll be nice to people and I'll be benevolent and I'll treat people nicely. And I speak from firsthand experience on this, because when I was a kid, I grew up in a family. My father was an Episcopal minister. And my first understanding of Jesus and altruism and all of that stuff when I was very young was that it just meant being nice to people and treating people fairly. Well, that sounds like a pretty good idea. Like you can do that and live a beautiful life, right? And the reason is because that is a policy that dovetails perfectly with egoism, to generally be nice to people and treat them fairly. But that is not what the actual code of morality called altruism is. If altruism just meant, hey, live your life and make your life as great as it can be, as wonderful as it can be, and while you're doing that, give people the benefit of the doubt and treat them generally benevolently, unless you find out that they're really bad people, in which case don't, right? If that is what altruism meant, I would call myself an altruist, and we'd just merge altruism and egoism, and we'd just have one morality, and we could get rid of this nightmare thing that is actual altruism that tells people to sacrifice. So yes, the answer to your question is people do misunderstand altruism, and they package deal it together. Package deal is when you pull things together under one concept that are that don't belong together, that actually conflict with each other in some way. And so people do adopt it that way. And this is how they can get themselves to feel like, yeah, I'm living as an altruist, but I'm also pursuing my values. The problem is that the portion of the package deal in that altruistic package deal, the portion in there that says to be really moral, you should be selflessly serving other people, not self-interestedly serving other people, that haunts people at a fundamental psychological level. And it makes you feel guilty. And you probably experienced this. I certainly did when I started to realize that altruism didn't just mean being nice to people, that there was more to it. And this is before I discovered that altruism is just false. It just doesn't have any facts to support the theory at all. So yeah, really good point there, that people misunderstand it, or they embrace this sort of vague idea about it, and then they try to use the better element of that to live a good life. And I think their premise there, their attempt there, is essentially egoistic. I just wish that they knew that it was two things, that it genuinely was an egoistic way to go, and that that's morally correct, right? To know that the way you're living is morally correct is extremely invigorating to your soul, and it's supportive of your self-esteem and your love of yourself. And so it's really necessary. And the point the phenomenon that you're pointing out here is this sort of netherland in which so many people live, where they don't really know what altruism means, and they don't really know what egoism means. They might not even use those words. Most people don't. They just feel like, oh, to be moral, I should give up my values and serve other people, but I also want to be happy, so I'm going to do this, but I'll be nice to people. And that's sort of the water in which most people swim. And it's I can't shake my finger at people for being there. They don't know the difference between these things and the clear definitions of these codes. And the reason they don't know it is because their parents, preachers, and teachers haven't told them. And not everyone is going to do deep dives into philosophy and try to figure things out. And even if you do, unless you're like a millennial genius, you're not going to come up with something like human life is the standard of value, and here's the inductive proof as to why that's the case. So all of us are to some extent at the mercy of the professional philosophers who have not done their jobs over the years, and the educational systems that we're subject to as we're growing up. And you just, you and others, and I included, we all try to figure out what's true as we're going, presumably, or at least the active-minded people try to figure it out. But you're not going to figure it all out unless you start reading and demanding that the ideas you accept make sense. And this kind of direct, sort of aggressive, active mindedness, like I will not accept ideas unless they make sense to me. If we just taught that to kids, they would do so well, because then they'd look at things like altruism and they go, something's wrong here. This doesn't make sense to me. I'm not going to accept it. Maybe I'll go look it up. Maybe I'll do an internet search. Does anyone clarify what altruism means, and what are the alternatives to altruism? And as soon as some young person starts doing that, they're going to start to find things that they can read that will start to clarify the world for them. But until you do that, you're really just stuck in this wretched position of relative ignorance about morality, which the world is still. I mean, we know so much. We can put spaceships on the moon. We can put crawly devices on Mars. We can cure all sorts of cancers. We got all sorts of scientific knowledge. But when it comes to knowledge about morality, we're just barely out of the cave. And so that's the problem. But yes, very good point about people adopting sort of a vague and inaccurate definition of altruism. And it's like a self-defense mechanism to do that, right? Because if you were to adopt it straight and then really try to live by it, I mean, you just live a miserable life, which is exactly what happened to Mother Teresa, by the way.
I have a follow-up question to that.
Sure.
Why do you think that altruism has been the dominant ethic throughout human history, and why did it take so long for rational egoism to develop compared to altruism?
Yeah, so rational egoism actually existed before altruism. It just didn't exist fully. So Aristotle's philosophy, Aristotle's ethics, which is basically called eudaimonia, or the Eudaimoneian ethics, and it's it's spelled out in his book, the Nicomachean Ethics, is essentially a form of egoism. It's the idea that eudaimonia, basically roughly translated to happiness or personal flourishing, is the aim. That's what you're supposed to be trying to do. And then Aristotle has different ways that he tries to map out about how to do that. And he's got, various virtues, and he's got this thing called the golden mean, and you're supposed to not be, too much this way or too much that way on something like courage. Take the virtue of courage. And if you're an utter coward, that's bad for you. But if you go too far in courage, you become reckless, and that's bad for you too. So you need to find this middle ground. And that's sort of the way that he thought about it. It's pretty not bad thinking for someone. In fact, it's very good thinking. But Aristotle did not, at least in my understanding. Now, I have some friends who are Aristotle scholars and say that Aristotle can be read in different ways, and some people think he came closer to this than at least I understand. But Aristotle did not, to my knowledge, identify scientifically why life is the standard of value and why human life is the standard of moral value. So it wasn't a proven standard of value undergirding this egoism of his. And then, a few hundred years later, you get Christianity comes along. And also Aristotle's philosophy was wrestling with Plato's ideas and with the sophists, and with I'm drawing a blank on something right now. It'll come to me in a minute. But you get Christianity, a few hundred years later, and there morality just takes a complete turn. And the whole idea is that being moral now is to act in a selfless manner, much in the way that Jesus does. And this is why, Jesus says, if you want to be my disciple, you must give away all your possessions and come and follow me and be a selfless person like me. And that's where I think altruism becomes codified into an actual moral code. Now, if you go way back in time to when people were living, somewhere between Aristotle and when people left the caves, right? And you've got people living in tribes and they're trying to stay alive in the wilderness and um, grouping together and operating as a tribe is in everyone's self-interest, because if you're out on your own, you're likely to get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger or whatever the threat is. But with your group, you're more likely to be able to live. And I suspect, although I don't know, and I don't think anyone knows this answer, but you can hypothesize to some extent on this, I suspect that the idea that you needed to sort of treat the group as the unit of concern may have begun then, and that sort of was the very beginning of this idea of the other being as important as it is. But as I think Jackson, it wasn't until the the philosopher Auguste Comte, a French philosopher who I believe lived in the 1800s, coined the term altruism. And the term really was not coined until he coined it. And he coined it to mean living for others. And that doesn't mean that the idea didn't exist before that term, but the a term itself was not given to the idea that you should self-sacrificially serve others until then. And that's why we now call the whole thing altruism. So when we say Jesus, advocated altruism, it's not that Jesus ever said, hey, you should be an altruist, but he did advocate that you live for others and that you sacrifice your values for other people. So it's a good question as to exactly where and how altruism started. But also part of your question was, why did altruism remain the dominant morality for so long, and to this day still does? That's a good question too, especially given that there are literally zero facts that support the idea. There's just story and tradition and guilt that essentially are heaped onto people to get them to accept this idea. And I think part of the problem is that egoism had not, until Ayn Rand did so in about 1957, egoism had not been given a scientific foundation yet. And because it hadn't been given a scientific foundation in life as the standard of value and what that means, and then that gives rise to a whole series of values and virtues and individual rights, right? And this is really important, because until you have that, you have like a Hobbesian type of egoism, which is, oh yeah, everybody's just out for himself and we're all gonna stab each other to get what we want. And if that's what people think egoism is, or if that's what people think the alternative to sacrificing yourself for others is, right? And this is, you either sacrifice yourself to others or you sacrifice others to yourself. Which one is it going to be? This big false alternative, I think, has been in people's minds for centuries, even millennia. And because of that, sort of thoughtful people were more like, well, I don't want to sacrifice others. That's barbaric. Maybe I'll, help others and try to do things for others and get by in that way. It seems more reasonable, I think, to most people. If your alternatives are, rape, pillage, and plunder, or sacrifice for others and then try to live a good life. So again, what we get from the clarity about these ideas, if we start to say, well, wait a minute, what does it mean to sacrifice for others? And why does anyone need to sacrifice for anyone? Why not just have a moral code of non-sacrifice? Why don't we say, hey, why should human beings sacrifice each other in any way at any time? And until someone asks that question and then is able to answer the dilemma by laying out a really clear, understandable, practical, logically grounded new moral code, everyone's just stuck between this false alternative. And so I think that's what we needed, and we didn't get it until Ayn Rand came along and spelled it out beautifully. And she did, she really did. She identified the false alternative. She came up with the questions that were necessary to get under everything. What are values? Why do we need them? Do we need morality at all? If so, why? And then, we've talked about this, I think, on previous episodes of Understanding. Those questions bring us down to a factual grounding for these concepts. And then once you get that factual grounding, you can start to build on that and think inductively about, well, what are values? Values are the things that enable us to stay alive. What are the things that do that? And then you start labeling those things values. So reason is a value, purpose is a value, freedom is a value, romantic relationships are a value, your career is a value. And then you get this actually life-serving morality that gets built off of that base. But until we had that base, I think we were just going to be toggling back and forth between the false alternative of sacrifice self versus sacrifice others. So
Yeah,
that's the best I could say. Yeah.
Yeah, that was great. That fully answers my questions. So I think this is a good follow-up. So Sylvanus asked in the chat, where is the line between egoist and a hedonist?
Yeah, that's a great question. So hedonism is the idea that pleasure is the standard of moral value, just pleasure. Whatever feels good, whatever gives you pleasure, that's what you should go after. And there's nothing wrong with pleasure. Egoism includes pleasure as an important value. Egoism holds that romantic relationships and the pleasure that comes with romantic sex is an enormous value to human beings. So egoism holds pleasure in high regard. The problem is that pleasure is not suitable as a foundation or as a standard of moral value. And the main reason is that it is only psychological in effect. I mean, there's a physical element to pleasure, right? You take a sip of some soda that you love, right? And there's a physical element, but the pleasure is just, oh, that feels good. It's just a psychological reaction that you're having to this. And that does not serve to actually give you life guidance. And this is why, for instance, someone who starts shooting heroin or taking some kind of drug that gives him pleasure can be like, oh, that felt really good. I'll do that again. And he does it again. Oh, that felt good too. This is really pleasurable. I'm just going to keep going after this pleasure. And within a short period of time, this person is addicted to heroin and lying in the gutter, and his life is wasting away, right? So if you uphold pleasure as the standard, it doesn't serve your life. Whereas if you uphold life as the standard, you can integrate life-serving pleasure with that perfectly. Give another example that's less abrupt than the heroin addict in the gutter. Suppose you are an athlete and you need to keep your body fat to a certain level, right? Because you're either a gymnast or maybe you're a ballerina or something like that. And you've got, in order to do the things, you've got to have your muscle, your fat to muscle ratio has to be a certain thing. But let's say you also love cake and ice cream and you're holding pleasure as the standard of value. So that's the thing. You should go after pleasure. That's what you should do. Well, you're going to start eating lots of cake and ice cream and maybe some pizza because it tastes really good. And you just keep doing this, right? And lo and behold, you're now not able to do your sport the way that you need to do it in order to make this a career and be a professional in this sport. So you see once again, or this sport or the art, take it either way, you see once again where holding pleasure as the standard is going to corrupt your life. Whereas if you hold life as the standard, you can still have pleasures, because in this case, you could go, okay, I'm in training season now. I got to, either eliminate or at least, minimize the cake and ice cream for a while, and you just thoughtfully do that. And then after the competition season is over or whatever, you go, I'm going straight to the ice cream store and I'm going to get myself a whole quart of ice cream and sit in front of the fireplace and eat it, right? You can do that because you're being thoughtful and you're holding your life, the long-term requirements of your life, including pleasure, which is a requirement of life, but it's one requirement of life. It's not the whole. Whereas life subsumes all of these things. Life also is biological. I mentioned earlier that pleasure is more sort of, oh, that just feels good, right? So you can be listening to music, and granted, there's a physical element to it, right? The music is hitting your eardrums, and that's causing sound, which is going to your brain, etc. So there's a physical element, but it's more of a spiritual type of value, and spiritual values are very important. I love my music. But there's a difference between that and the physical nature of life, right? You're either alive or you're not. And if you're not, right, that's the end of the road, right? And so to live as a human being means to remain in existence. That's one level of living, right? You're still alive, but just barely breathe, just breathing and eating is not a human life. What is a human life? It's the kind of full life that if you start thinking about it, you're like, yeah, it means having a career you love, relationships that you love, recreational activities you love, enjoying art that you love, right? You start to build this idea in your mind, and pleasure is a very important part of all of this, but it's not the whole of it. The one concept that captures the whole of it is life. If by life you mean life as a human being. You can use the concept of flourishing there if you want. I find that very helpful and descriptive. But that's the difference between hedonism and egoism, is that standard of value. And that's a very good question, by the way. It's if you don't understand this, you can't really understand what egoism is, because pleasure is an important value and it's a huge part of egoism, but it's not the whole. And that's sort of the way I would think about it.
Sylvanus asked a follow-up question, which is moderation a valid principle?
I think moderation is a valid principle in context, right? There's certainly, I love to drink some wine every once in a while. There's a particular Greek wine called Retsina that I love. And I love it so much that I could drink a whole bottle in one sitting, if I wasn't paying attention. But I'm a pretty short guy, and I'm not very, very large generally. And if I drink a whole bottle of wine, I'm going to be drunk. So I don't want to do that, right? So I want to drink in moderation, even though I like it enough that I could just keep pounding them down. But I don't want to do that. Why? Because I think long term about the fact, well, A, I don't want to get addicted to this stuff. B, I've got to get up tomorrow at 4 or 5 and get to work. And I love my work, and I want to get up without a headache, and I want to get up feeling good, right? So I think long range and wide range about my values, and that necessitates moderation in this particular thing. But there are things that you don't want to be moderate in, and that would be things like moral virtue. I don't want to be moderately honest or moderately just or moderately rational, right? I want to be extremely just, rational, and honest at all times. So you can't take a concept like moderation and say, is it good or bad? It has to be, is it good or bad in this context, used in this way? And that's what I would say about that. For more on this kind of thing, by the way, I highly recommend Ayn Rand's essay. The concept of extreme is the same kind of thing. Is extreme good or bad? Well, we could take the exact examples that I just gave. Is it good to be extreme in the amount of wine that I drink? So drink as much as I can, right? No, that would be really bad. Is it good to be extreme in virtue and be extremely honest and just? Yes, it is. So the concept of extreme is a perfectly legitimate concept, but it doesn't make any sense until and unless you're talking about a specific thing that you're going to be extreme about. Likewise for moderate, it doesn't make sense until you're talking about a specific thing you're going to be moderate about. And this is why Ayn Rand wrote the essay Extremism, which is extreme with an ism on the end. And then she called that the art of smearing. And that's the title of the essay. And the theme of that essay is extremism sounds like a bad thing. It's like extremism, you're being an extremist, right? It's always used as a negative. It's got a negative connotation. But there's no object being included about which we're talking about going to extremes. And if you bring in the object and you say, well, what about virtue, like justice or honesty, or what about vice, right? Racism or something like that. Should we go to extremes? Well, you certainly shouldn't be extremely racist. You shouldn't be racist at all. That's unjust. But you should be extremely just and you should be extremely honest. So here again, the concept doesn't make sense unless you anchor it to content. And that's why Rand called extremism an anti-concept. She labeled this as a certain kind of fallacy. And that's a fallacy whereby things get packaged in together. So anything that's extreme gets packaged into this thing. And then the negative connotation from extremism or the positive connotation from moderate, right? We could call moderatism, like we should be moderate in everything. Well, that's ridiculous. Then I should be moderate in honesty? No. So it's the exact same kind of thing: extremism or extreme or moderate, and extremism or moderatism, which is why I highly recommend that you read Rand's article on this, because you'll get your head around the nature of what an anti-concept is, which is really helpful to know because there are lots of them out there. And that essay is just beautiful. I wrote an essay on conceptual fallacies that you can find on my Substack titled Thinking in Principles, where I lay out a bunch of these. But I would read Rand's essay first because it's where this idea was first spelled out in an essay, and it's just it's a groundbreaking essay that clarifies this very kind of thing. So great question. Thank you.
All right. The next question we have is from John, and he asks, are we losing the battle of egoism versus altruism, reason versus mysticism, individualism versus collectivism?
I don't think we are losing the battle, and I'm probably close to alone in this kind of an assessment, but let me make my argument for this. Certainly at the political level, there's tribalism is just all over the place, and no one can deny that. But I'm not sure that tribalism didn't exist even before wokeism arose and Trumpism came around. I think we had sort of latent sleeping kind of tribalism in place. And I think we had it largely because altruism is sort of undergirding everyone's political views. And if you think that you should be, living for and sacrificing for others, well, you can't do it for the whole world. So people wind up doing it for their local group of some sort, right? They find a group and they're like, oh, okay, you're going to be my people. You're the people I'm going to sacrifice for. And that kind of sacrifice includes sacrificing your judgment. So you're not going to judge. If you disagree with the group, you're just going to go, that's all right. We'll let my judgment go and we'll go with what the group thinks. And this is tribalism. This is what tribalism is. And it's rampant, but I'm not sure that it wasn't rampant even before. I think it just wasn't as obvious before. So at the political / cultural level, I think there's a huge amount of tribalism and collectivism and not much individualism. But, and this is the big but, And Jackson and I live in a bit of a bubble because we deal with through Objective Standard Institute and through my journal, The Objective Standard, we deal with a small but growing group of young people who are really getting their head around these ideas, and then they're getting out in the world and talking about them and doing so extremely clearly and eloquently and powerfully. And that is what it takes to turn the tide in a culture. And we're not the only organization doing this, but I think we're one of the best organizations doing this. And the multiplier effect that we're achieving with this, and we're just getting started. We've only been doing this for about 5 years, is huge. And because of that, I'm actually very optimistic about the future because uh, the world is changed and futures are made not by majorities but by extremely thoughtful minorities, and the founding fathers of the United States are case in point, right? So 250 years ago, these guys and their wives and families got together and they were like, hey, there something is very wrong about this situation with the king bossing us around and taxing us without our representation. And we've been reading these books by John Locke and these other guys and Montesquieu, and we think that we think there's another way to do government, and we're gonna put together our thoughts on this, and we're gonna lay it out, and then we're gonna tell King George we're not doing that thing anymore, and they did it. Well, this was a very small group of people, relatively speaking, up against the world's biggest army at the time, and they spelled out their ideas. They fought a war. They continued spelling out their ideas. They wrote not only initially they write the Declaration of Independence. Later they write the Constitution and the Federalist Papers and all of that. And they made the change. And we know they did because we're living in this beautiful world that was made possible because of it. So here's the moral of the story and the argument that I'm making. We don't need to change the whole world. We need to change a small, extremely active-minded, intelligent, and thoughtful minority of people who are going to work together to advocate and advance these ideas. And if we do it, and we're already doing it, we just need to do it more and bigger and better, which we're constantly striving to do. I think that within 20 or 30 years, we're going to be living in a better world. I really do. I think we're going to see it in my lifetime. And I know some people will laugh and say, oh, that's ridiculous. Not going to happen. So be it. I don't really care what other people think about this. I'm seeing in my own daily life and in my dealing with the young people I work with, the kind of potential that gave rise to the founding of America. And I'm seeing it in real time. So I am optimistic. And this is not to say that I don't see and I'm not worried about the tribalism and collectivism more broadly throughout the culture. It's there. But I'm seeing a rising tide of extremely thoughtful individualists who are going to make change. And I think they're going to make very, very big change. So, yeah.
That's great. So next question is from Benjamin, and he asks, why do strict determinists try to prescribe an ethical code or advocate for political ideology? What's the rationale?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question for them. Yeah, if you're a determinist, it doesn't really make any sense to try to convince people of things. And what the determinists will say is they'll say, look, that's ridiculous. I'm trying to convince them because I know that the physical nature of their brains is such that if I take the physical nature of my brain and then make sounds that go into their ears and make their brains move, that they're going to do the things that I want them or would prefer them to do, or that they might do them at least, right? And so they have an answer for this. They'll say, look, determinism doesn't mean you can't persuade people. It means that, in fact, some of them will say you couldn't persuade people if determinism wasn't true, because how are you going to get ideas into their head and know that they're going to, push the right buttons to make them do the thing that you want them to do? So they have these kind of quasi answers to these questions. But the spirit of your question, I think, is good, which is that it doesn't make sense to try to persuade people of things because if determinism is true, they're just going to do what they're going to do. Moreover, why try to persuade them? If you're trying to persuade them, it just means that you have to be trying that because you don't have free will. And if you stop trying to persuade them, it means you have to do that because you don't have free will. You're not choosing to persuade them. So why waste your time persuading people? Why don't you just go do something that's more fun, given that if you were to do that, you just have to be doing that anyway, right? So, and of course, none of this really makes sense because free will is introspectively and self-evidently true. It's just we can observe ourselves choosing to think or not to think, to focus our minds or not, to go by reason or to let our other mental faculty, our rational faculty take over, our emotional faculty take over. We can observe that this happens. So I don't think they have strong answers to your question, but they do claim to have. I've heard Sam Harris give these kinds of answers, and I've heard Alex O'Connor give these kinds of answers, and they're not persuasive at all. One of the things I would advocate when you're talking to people about free will, leave the word free will out of the picture because that's like a trigger word that makes them feel like and just ask people, when you get up in the morning, do you make decisions? And most people say, yeah, I decided to skip my workout this morning because I wanted to go on a long walk. I had an idea I wanted to work through or whatever. They'll tell you some decision that they made. And you can say, well, look, a decision is when you cut off. This decide comes from the same root as scissors. Decide, the side in there is the same as scissors, right? So it's the root is to cut and to cut away. So when you make a decision, you're saying, I'm going to do this thing and I'm cutting away all these other things that I could have done, but I'm not going to do. And so if people do make decisions, that's what a choice is. I'm doing this one thing, which means I can't do these other things. And this, I think, can help some people. It doesn't help everyone. It can help some people to see the self-evident nature of free will. If you just kind of get away from the concept, or not the concept, because the concept is still there. But you get away from the word free will. Another word, or a slightly different concept, actually, even is agency. If you say to someone, do you think people have agency? Do you think that they control in some way their lives? And if the answer is yes, if we do, either we control our lives or we don't, right? And if we don't, we're determined. And if we do, then the means by which we control our lives is through free will. So if you can get people to buy into the concept of agency, they're kind of buying into free will there. And there's an interesting guy. There's a guy named George Mack, who I've heard on Kevin Williamson's podcast. And he does a whole lot of writing specifically about agency. He's a very good writer and he's a thoughtful guy. He's extremely intelligent. I advocate looking him up. But what's interesting is he writes these very long essays about agency. And he never once mentions free will. So, and he's claiming that high agency people, and this is his big term, high agency people are more effective in creating beautiful lives and creating products and the like, because they're making decisions about what they're going to do. They're taking full control of their lives. And he talks about this stuff beautifully, but it's notable that he never mentions free will in any of the discussions. And when I read this first long essay about this that he wrote, I made note of that, and I was kind of like, this is so interesting because so many people are, high-fiving it and giving it likes on social media. And I'll bet a large number of those people would call themselves determinists, but here they're celebrating agency in spades when it's just a different word for essentially the same thing. Now, there are shades of difference between, agency and free will, and we could talk about that, but they're pretty close to synonymous. So anyway, that's a bit of a long-winded answer, but yeah, I've heard determinists try to answer the question that you asked, but not very convincingly. So
We have another question in the chat from Ken, and he asks, is self-ownership a valid concept?
Well, it depends on what you mean by this, right? Ownership is a concept that pertains to property. And so there's a sense in which talking about self-ownership is kind of inverts back on itself, because the agent is the owner of property. And then you're saying, but the agent owns the agent. So there's a philosophic sort of circularity to use of it that way. However, and this is a big however, most people who use this idea are using it in a perfectly legitimate and totally innocent way. And what they mean is, my life belongs to me. And that is both true and philosophically correct. It's true in the sense that your life does belong to you, but the language used there is perfectly fine philosophically, as far as I'm concerned. Belongs to is a more sort of fundamental way of thinking about ownership. Ownership and property are, in my mind at least, closer to sort of the political level. It's like, oh, whose property is this? Well, we'll have to find out, does anyone have the deed, who created the thing, etc. But when you talk about this belongs to me, if you're at camp and you're a kid and you find a frog in the woods and you want to put the frog in a cage for a few days to examine him, and another bully at the camp comes along, tries to take your frog, you could say, look, this frog belongs to me. I'm the one who found it. And you're not really talking at the political level here about property rights per se, but you are talking about something that is correctly yours by virtue of the law of causality. You caused the frog to cease being just a wild animal and to become, for a period of time, a domesticated animal, or a domestic animal, in that you caught him and you are the one putting him in the cage. So the frog correctly belongs to you by virtue of the law of causality. John Locke talks a little bit about this kind of thing in his second treatise of government. He uses a deer. If you shoot a deer, you basically have converted the deer from a raw, from raw material into a value. And by virtue of that, you correctly can be said to own the deer. And I think this is all true. And I think that saying, I have property in myself is probably not the best way to say that, or I own myself is probably not the best way to say that. I think the better thing to say is, I have a right to my life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. And so you have a right to property. And these rights derive from the fact that you are a certain kind of being. You're a being who, by virtue of having a rational faculty and a volitional faculty, as we were just speaking about, has to be free to act on his rational judgment in order to live fully as a human being. Right? If I take Frederick Douglass and put him in a cage or treat him as a slave, right, he can't live fully as a human being. He's living as some, barely recognizable version of what we would call a human being. He's being treated as an animal. In order to live fully as a human being, he has to be free from that. And so that's what rights are all about. They're the right to act on your own judgment. That's your right to liberty, free of coercion. The right to pursue your goals and values. That's the pursuit of happiness. The right to keep and use the product of your effort. That's the right to property. And generally and more broadly, the right to your life, the right to live your life as you see fit. That's the right to life. And that sort of subsumes all of them. If you say, as in relation to that, if you say, look, my life belongs to me, I think that's fine. And I've seen objectivists get all up in arms about people using this kind of language. Somebody will say something like, my life belongs to me, or I own myself, or something like that. And people come down on them like a ton of bricks, and they're like, "You're using this concept the wrong way," and et cetera, et cetera. It's like you're violating some commandment that you heard from from on high, and it's absurd. Um, there is a sense in which technically there's something a little bit illogical about talking about self as property, but it matters not. It's just such a trivial thing relative to all the other things that people need to think about and understand. So I would say I pretty much walk away from people if they start getting into all of that. I wrote a piece about one of my favorite thinkers, Aubrey Herbert, in the Objective Standard. And I bring this issue up there because Herbert talks about self-ownership. And he does it in a way that I think is really, really beautiful, actually. And I talk about the way that he does that in relation to the way that Ayn Rand talks about it, because Ayn Rand talks about your life belonging to you as well. So I recommend that article, by the way, that essay on Aubrey Herbert in the Objective Standard. I think you would enjoy it. It brings up this subject explicitly and talks about it. Herbert lived before Rand. He died like a year before she was born. So he was a remarkable thinker. He saw selfishness as a virtue, believe it or not. You'll read about this in that essay if you read it. And he talked about politics and rights in moral terms. He wasn't as precise as Rand, and he wasn't as quite as deep as Rand, but he was a remarkable thinker. And he did talk about self-ownership, and I think did it in a way that was actually helpful and thoughtful. So I'd look at that. Great question. Thanks.
All right. We've got 5 more questions in the queue, and I know we're at an hour and a half. Craig, do you want to take one more?
Let's do one more, and then we'll reserve the others for next week.
Okay. So the next question is from Shelby, and she asks, is David Hume's black swan misconception based on failing to apply cross-classification and measurement omission?
So this is a humdinger for the final question. I'll say a few words on that now, but this is a question about induction, and I can't answer that briefly. Read the end part of the question again. So after the black swan, is it an error of cross class? Go ahead.
Yeah, based on failing to apply cross classification and measurement omission.
Yeah, I'm actually going to stay away from this technical terminology because people don't even just start explaining what measurement omission means here would be, or cross classification for that matter, would be a very, very big task. I'll say this. When you are inducing about anything, you have to do so in a contextual way. And if you know that there are lots of birds that come in different colors, and by the time people were thinking about white swans versus black swans, they knew that. Well, there are lots of birds, and hummingbirds alone come in multiple colors. They're my favorite birds, by the way. I love those things. If you know that about birds, that they come in multiple colors, and then you see one bird that seems consistently to come in white, to draw the conclusion that this bird is only ever, possibly ever white, is a hasty generalization. It just doesn't make sense given what you know about birds. So we don't even need to get into the technical terminology about cross-classification and measurement omission, which would be a fine thing for another time. But whoever is thinking about that before he says, I'm going to draw the line here and say that swans are only and always white, just doesn't make any sense, because you haven't seen enough swans relative to the fact that you've seen many birds that come in other colors. And if you're, let's say you're in England or Scotland at the time that this happens, and you've only seen white swans there in Scotland, well, you know the earth is very big. You know there are other regions, there are other places where there are different colored birds as well. It's just epistemologically irresponsible to demand that swans can only be white. Now, there's nothing wrong with saying, of all the swans I've ever seen, they've all been white. Or, as far as I know, swans are white. That's perfectly logical and responsible conclusion at that time. But it doesn't make any sense to try to claim that they cannot be another color. That's the difference. And this is, we don't need to put that kind of absolutism on things that we don't have grounds for putting that kind of absolutism on. Just say what you know at any given time in your inductive ventures, and you won't have this problem. You see white swans. Let's say here, I have only seen hummingbirds. I live in Southern California. We have lots of hummingbirds, and I've seen hummingbirds with copper-colored chests and blue chests and green chests and red chests, but I have never seen a black hummingbird. Now, I'm told there are black hummingbirds. I keep forgetting to look this up on the internet. I need to do that because I want to see them. But I'm told there are black hummingbirds. But how silly would it be for me to, never even having heard that, to just say, I've only seen hummingbirds in these 6 colors, and therefore, and I haven't seen a black one, so black ones don't exist, right? It's the same kind of irresponsibility that people engaged in if they tried to say that all swans and only swans can be white, or that all swans are white and swans can only be white. So that's the way I would think about that. And that's a short answer. If we want to talk about measurement omission and concept formation and that kind of stuff in a future show, I'd be happy to do that, but we would need more than the few minutes we had left here. So good question. All right, guys and gals, thanks so much for joining me. I love doing these. I hope you're enjoying them. I've done for several years now, probably even over 10 years. I've tried different approaches to creating videos and doing shows. This is the first time that it's ever been the case that I just love every minute of this. I love the way that these go because I don't really have to prepare for them. I just come and see what kind of questions we have. I mean, I think I do some thinking about the monologue before I start because I want to come in with something reasonably useful. But then when we get to the Q&A, it's just fun. And if you guys keep coming back with great questions, I would love to keep doing this. So I urge you to do that. We'll resume again next Thursday. I think, Jackson, is that correct? Or is something else slated for next Thursday?
That's correct. We'll be back.
All right, excellent. Yeah, keep coming back and send in written questions if you'd like to, but also feel free to click the link to get into the queue to hop on a call with me, and we'll do that then. So till next week, keep using your minds and loving your life. We'll see you guys then.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Jackson.